How goes it, fellow travelers? Sojourner Kai here, and lads, it is good to be back for another round of proper video game reviewing, and I'm fashionably late to the party as always with a review for Celeste. I'd say that Celeste is kind of like a Marvel movie, and by a Marvel movie I mean something like Iron Man or... yeah, that's the best example I can think of right now. A piece of media that's simple and yet so good that you don't mind watching it over and over again, or in the case of the video game equivalent, playing it multiple times over just to get the satisfying ending. Neither Iron Man nor Celeste are perfect in their own rights, but they don't have to be, because their imperfections are what give them all that much more character. Celeste appeals to a wide audience, but it does it in such a compact and neat way that neither one side nor the other feels like they're being pandered to or brushed aside. Do you want a platformer? We have a platformer. Do you like amazing soundtracks? We have an amazing soundtrack. Do you like your games to have a good story with fun characters? Well, we got those people from Animal Crossing to do voice work, except this time you'll cry manly tears. It's just so good. Everything from the color schemes right down to the art style feels intentional, and there's something satisfying in knowing that every aspect had full and complete thought put into it. What I felt gave that away immediately is their art style and general art direction. Celeste is in pixel graphics, and after playing so many indie games over the years that have also resorted to pixel graphics, I was a bit skeptical about how great this game would actually be. Terraria, Stardew Valley, Katana Zero, all great games, all done in a 16-bit style, which has started to wear on me quite a bit. The reason why I don't particularly love 16-bit graphics lies in how sharp it is. There's nothing smooth for the eyes to look at, since you can't make smooth lines with a limited box of pixels, which in turn wears on what eyesight I have left. The limited pixels also lead into the fact that you can't smoothly transition color palettes, meaning that your choices have to be bold enough to pop out of the screen and show a difference between what's part of the world and what's part of the player character. These loud characters' inherent visual limitation in this style itself has made me, well, I'd say that even dislike is too strong of a word. It's more of it's just not my preference. Okay, maybe I've played too many indie games and I shouldn't be judging them for what limitations they worked with, but my points still remain. 16-bit graphics aren't a great design choice, yet at the same time, Celeste art direction, while the game is chiefly in pixelated graphics, proves that the style choice was very intentional. How can I tell? Because Celeste doesn't force everything on screen to be in a 16-bit style. Text from character dialogue is the most common example of this, since it pops up quite frequently. There's a slightly animated portrait for each character in a cute, hand-drawn style. The text, while it's nothing too special, fits these portraits and by extension the rest of the game in a satisfying way. What this does is it gives visual separation between when you're playing the game and when you are given a moment's respite to let characters exchange dialogue. Additionally, it gives characters a bit more personality, and lets the oft more cartoonish 16-bit design have its violence and playing segments separated from that. Madeline literally explodes when she dies, whether that be through impalement on spikes or falling to her death, and the retro-esque graphics allow for that kind of death to be visually fun, like fireworks celebrating how terrible I am at this game. Yep, that's a lot of deaths. That's all to say that while the game is pixelated, other aspects of it show that it didn't have to be. It chose to be that way, and it owns the mixing of styles by giving characters animated portraits, or even by having a text font that doesn't look like it was pulled out of an 80s arcade machine. It's subtle, and those examples are far outweighed by the main visual aspects surrounding gameplay, but it's those details that make every encounter feel all the more special. And hey, each character's dialogue box has a slightly different background, so that's pretty cool too. What I'm trying to say is that Celeste is a very simplistic looking game, and it's something that can be celebrated because of the qualities surrounding it, even in this day and age where a 16-bit art style seems to be taking over everything. Celeste, gameplay-wise, is a platformer through and through, and platformers are what I consider to be my jam: peanut butter, 2 slices of bread cut diagonally with a crust on it because my mom didn't raise no bitch, and it is by far the simplest game concept that I have played in a long time, with, once again, far more satisfying results than I expected. The creators of Celeste really said, alright, all you can do is jump, dash for a double jump, and cling onto walls for a short period of time. Pretty simple. Pretty simple. Then they said, okay, how do we get that jump and dash to do all of this other crazy other stuff while still being skill expressive and leaving it all up to the player? It's a fairly tough platformer that doesn't shy away from its brusque difficulty. With simple mechanics comes a very simple yet equally challenging platforming experience. The entire goal for each part of a level is to reach the end of that specific room, but if it happens to be a long one with difficult jumps, you have to start over. There's no difficulty mod, no ability to skip sections, none of that. The game gives you a few tips and then lets you figure out things for yourself from that point onward, meaning that a second run is more rewarding because of the mechanics that you know now how to utilize. There's no hand-holding or second chances given here, and as frustrating as that can be in some parts, it's equally gratifying to know that I am conquering this mountain one jump at a time. Well, except for Flag 11 on Summit Climb. That segment can Shujiao for all I care. Speaking of Flag 11, let's talk level design, because it's kind of vital to everything that platformers stand for. I mean, yeah, level design is important to virtually every video game, but with platforming, you feel out the level. Your entire sense of success or failure depends on landing that specific jump on that specific pixel, which usually has a greater margin for error the further you get into any platformer game. But it's not just enough to make a jump. You have to add new mechanics, new angles to work with, and you either introduce new things for the players to do or new ways to interact with specific levels. Ori and the Will of the Wisps is an example of the former, where new mechanics are introduced to further enhance the connected map and areas. And Celeste is the latter. Your mechanics are jump and dash and nothing more than that. If any changes are made to those things, it's explained in the form of new interactables for the specific level. Jump into the bubble to go a short distance, hit the feather to fly for a few seconds, dash into the star goop to get launched into the wall. Gimmicks are level specific, sure, but the separate rooms are challenging enough and different enough to make playing them fun. Most of the levels, save for the summit, were designed like mazes and you had to figure out which way led to the top. Granted, the best rule of thumb was to the right and up, but in segments that required keys or perhaps longer segments that cut back to the left quite a ways, it became a bit of a platforming puzzle. Some of that adventuring or searching for the next section led me to different rooms with collectibles, and in this game's case it's strawberries. Now, on my first playthrough, I made it a mission to not collect the strawberries since I was recording it for a playthrough and didn't want to have long sections dedicated to failing at getting them, but immediately after I finished those recordings, I was itching to get every single one of them. Some of them you really have to hunt for, and others I remember accidentally stumbling upon during my first run. The collectibles don't really change too much aside from a slightly different ending in which getting more strawberry rewards you with greater reactions from your friends. That, and you can brag to people by saying that you 100%ed Celeste, so there's that as well. The only cost is the abrupt difficulty. I spent a good majority of my first run in the fade to black that occurs after death, but as one of the early postcards reminded me, deaths were always a way of learning the game better. With each death, I had learned a little more about that room and gradually got better and eventually beat the game. I can't imagine how many more I would have added or how much longer my playthrough would have been if I had taken the time to get every collectible. However, something I've never been a fan of has been difficulty that leaves almost no room for error, when a game replaces difficulty with segments where you have to wait for something to happen. I don't have the fastest reactions of any human ever, so I know that there are some sections that will be tough to work around since I have to aim things pretty perfectly. The one checkpoint I had the toughest time with was checkpoint frickin' 11 on the summit climb. Yeah, I can hear you already.
But Kai, checkpoint 11 isn't even that hard. I beat it in one try without even thinking.
And alright, I get it, you're better at video games than I am. So is pretty much everyone else, aside from that one journalist who couldn't clear Cuphead's tutorial. This jump was so precise, where you have to jump, dash here, over the spikes, onto the crystal to reset your jumps, then up and around in the slip, then a simple wall jump onto the next flag. Easy, right?
Not for my tiny little brain it wasn't.
The jump was so precise that after I'd reset countless times after dying a countless number of deaths, I said to myself, beating this checkpoint isn't going to feel satisfying anymore, it's going to feel like I'm getting revenge on it. This was just one example of a couple of jumps that took me an abnormally long time to clear, but it was by far the worst one. It made me think though, perhaps we need more games like this. Games that have points that require greater precision and don't give the player second chances. It's perfectly fine for something whose greater value is in its artistic expression like Ori to exist, but it's also equally fine for the games like Celeste to take dedication and a bit of masochism to complete to exist as well. If the difficulty had been removed from this game by allowing the player to skip to the next checkpoint after a few deaths, the experience would have been vastly different. While I'm not a fan of Flag 11, I'm also equally fine with its continued existence and hope that someone else out there who has played this game understands my pain. What I didn't like was trying to wait for something to happen. For the majority of its playing time, Celeste is fast-paced and doesn't give you time to think when you start clearing a room. You're usually given a good look over of the layout, but after that it's up to muscle memory and knowing what to do in advance. Then came my two least favorite segments of the game, and before I tell you what they are, let me tell you exactly what they did wrong. They made me sit and wait for something to happen while applying some additional level-specific gimmick that made that waiting time nerve-wracking. The quick reactions that usually had to follow felt like they were at a large disconnect from the rest of the game, which I reiterate is mostly fast-paced, ridiculously smooth platforming and puzzle solving. First up, the wind level. I thought that the added difficulty of working against something that made your horizontal distance more limited was unique and challenging in its own way. But on the other hand, I really hated how there were segments where you'd struggle to move forward for 5 to 10 seconds, only to have that first jump fail and you'd be back to where you started. Then you had the mirror level with the floating eyeball dudes. I don't know what was wrong with me when I played this level for the first time, but again, it was something that made me have to wait to complete the level. Wait for the eyeball to charge, jump, move forward a bit, wait again, move forward some more. Waiting is a mechanic that I consider counteractive to Celeste's platforming design because at its core, it's a fast-paced adventure up a mountain filled with exploration and jumps that require split-second reactions. The only real downtime is when Madeline pauses to talk to the other characters present in the game. But otherwise, you can and are encouraged to speed through this game. Not to mention that the game itself is already inherently difficult, so when this weird pseudo-difficulty pops up on a couple of levels, it feels wrong. Now, Celeste is fun because it's difficult and a fantastic take on simple platformer mechanics, but it's memorable because of its story. Yes, surprisingly, there's a story to be told as well, and it's far more compelling than I expected. I knew going into it that it contained themes about anxiety and other connected mental illnesses, but I didn't expect it to be as fun or engaging to follow as it was here. To be perfectly honest, I was judging a book by its cover, and thought that its simplistic design portrayed what would be a mediocre story about, depression. Depression isn't something that should be taken lightly. What I'm saying is that based on how basic Celeste looked, I expected it to have the same emotional weight as one of those hashtag relatable teen dramas like 13 Reasons Why. Based on what I had heard, and specifically how this game's main themes are largely centered around anxiety and self-acceptance, I thought that those story elements would have been shoved down my throat I can't think of any examples right now that aren't NSFW. I was honestly worried that the writing wouldn't have been all that great and that a heavy emphasis on characters would distract from platforming. Once again, Celeste proved me completely wrong. What sold me on the story was how, like Night in the Woods, I could experience as much of it as I wanted to. Celeste is a platformer first, and it understands that if you're not there for the story, you don't have to be distracted by it. But in case you wanted to know more about the characters in the game itself, it's there for you to explore at your own volition. And heck, by the time I met Theo for the first time, I was so enthralled with the rest of the game that I figured I might as well take a second to try and learn as much as I possibly could through dialogue. And so I did. And it was a pleasant surprise. The story of Celeste is fairly simple, much like the gameplay mechanics within. The player character, Madeline, wants to climb Celeste Mountain as a way to prove her own self-worth. She is, as another character known simply as Granny put it, so unbelievably mad at herself and wants to climb the mountain for the sake of climbing it, but I always saw that she used the climb as a way for her to vent her frustrations. The other major character throughout all of this is Theo, an easygoing traveler from the faraway, mystical land of Seattle. He's on the mountain because he didn't know which direction he wanted to go in life, and figured that reaching the summit would be a great way to gain some perspective. That's a terrible pun. Most of the time you met Theo towards the end of a level, and I saw that as a way for the game to check up on the player. You know, make sure that they're doing okay, share a story or two. I loved how Theo talked like a normal person who just wanted to do right by the world, and who cared about Madeline as a fellow human being without his dialogue sounding overly forced by the writers. I wanted to talk with him, and since Madeline's reaction to him was initially cordial, if a bit spacey, it made the conversation-loving side of my brain light up, while the part of me that's obsessed with lore hooked onto these segments and never let go. And it's a platformer. Most platformers don't have compelling backstories to them, let alone details that you could pick apart and read into at your own will. It's important to understand that these characters are charming in their own rights, and while talking to them makes the game feel more complete and gives me a better understanding of it, I don't think that I'd be entirely lost if I had chosen to avoid conversation either. It's that level of choice that I enjoyed so heavily, especially among things that can come across as rather forced and or pandering if done incorrectly. Celeste Mountain is a magic mountain that has the unique ability of bringing out a physical manifestation of one's twisted self. The worst part of you brought to life and set up as a roadblock on your way to the mountain's summit, where the only way to reach that summit is to accept and overcome your own shortcomings. Theo's biggest fear is being trapped, so it makes sense that the mountain traps him in an unbreakable crystal. Madeline, on the other hand, thoroughly hates herself and has issues with anxiety and depression, as we find out through some dialogue. Anxiety and depression are most chiefly manifested through thoughts of uncertainty, self-hatred, and a lack of will to do much of anything. So when Celeste Mountain brings out the worst in Madeline, it makes sense that it would be basically herself, but a darker version that spews nothing but negativity. It's only once she learns to accept herself that she's able to complete the climb to the summit with the help of her goth alter ego. It's an ending that comes full circle, and an ending that is made doubly satisfying through the feeling of achievement that came with beating this game. One of Steam's tags for this game is a precision platformer, and yeah, it really does reward precise, but not limited, movements that are difficult, but not impossible. There were a few jumps or segments that I got legitimately stumped on and had to come back to at later dates, sure, but I always did come back to clear them. Celeste is a charming game that, while its visuals may be simplistic at a first glance, is probably one of the most fleshed out games that I've played in recent years. The dialogue is great, the platforming is simple yet offers a challenge to anyone playing it for the first time, the music itself is top-notch quality. I loved how Lena, we're gonna stick with Lena Raine. The composer for this game's soundtrack mixed classical piano and string instruments with crunchy synthesizers to complete a sense of grandeur with the retro graphics. I loved how for the majority of the game, when there's a dialogue segment, each character has a neat little animated portrait. Then when goth Madeline goes off on real Madeline later in the game, she starts crawling out of that portrait to subvert that expectation. Subverted expectations. Yeah, that sounds about right. In short, this game completely subverted my expectations, in a good way, and rose above and beyond what I expected from my first glance at it. It is an incredibly solid game, and I highly recommend it if you ever get a chance to pick it up. And that's all I have for this video. Thank you all so much for being patient with me on these upload speeds. I know that I'm not the most consistent with it, but I hope that this helps break up the silence at least a little bit. If you're new here and like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel for more video essays like this one. I'm also on Twitter and Twitch at these handles with the links in the description. And for the rest of you, thank you all so much for watching. With that, I'm out. Safe travels everyone, and goodbye.